Hello! This is going to be a basic review of a Skyjiro Warlord Katana. Now, before I start, there's a couple things I need to ramble about, as I often do, and I'm no stranger to YouTube statistics. I know that most of you are tuning out at this point, but stats be damned. If you're going to listen to what I have to say, then there are a few important considerations to keep in mind that may skew your opinion of what I'm saying. The sword is secondhand. I acquired it from a friend of mine who's a fellow practitioner in Toyama Ryu, and that's really the important bit to keep in mind, that it might not be representative of something you would get brand new from Skyjiro, though I would say that this one doesn't show a lot of signs of handling, has a few cutting scratches. Still, keep in mind it's secondhand. Also note, I'm not affiliated with Skyjiro in any way that I'm aware of, so yeah, I got this sword with my own money, and I'm going to review it as honestly as I can. The last thing I should note is my own internal biases. You should know that prior to owning this sword, I had very little experience with Skyjiro. I got to see some photos on the internet, but my handling experience with their swords and products was pretty minimal. Personally, I would say that I was a kind of not big fan of their products. I didn't see any reason to buy them. I thought they might be a little bit overpriced, and they didn't really do a lot for me. This is my entitled face. 'Cause I'm snobby, I guess. After owning one though, my tunes changed around just a little bit, and I hope you continue watching the review to see why. I was wrong. Wait, I can totally do that better. I was wrong all along. On to the review bits. The Fuchi, Kashira, and Suba all have a wave type theme to them, and I would describe them as marginally less shitty than the shitty shit that you might get out of production level stuff in China. To suffice to say, I'm not overly impressed with the build quality. They look like simple cast pieces with adornments, but there are a couple nice things to say in that. One, the detail on the fittings, while it's not really crisp, not in the same way that I've seen from Hanwei or even Cold Steel, it's not overly crappy in the sense that there's no detail or images are obscured or look lumpy or weird or not good at all. Just that the casting level really isn't up to par when it comes to some of the other swords that are available in the same price point. Still, the sword has a little bit of charm, and the adornments of silver and gold on the black theme really aren't way overdone. It doesn't make it look gaudy or stupid. Finding that kind of balance between decorative and gaudy, while it's very subjective and personal, I think they did reasonably well on these fittings in that way. What I like about the fittings is really how they're assembled on the handle type object, the suka, the overall grip. The assembly is actually pretty good. There's not some big gap or giant transition between the Fuji Kashira and the black silk Ito. Oftentimes there's a big lump or a big transition you can feel with your fingers, and you don't feel that here. The diamonds are relatively even and well spaced, the Ito is tight, and those attentions to detail aren't things that you find all the time on production swords at this price, or even swords much more expensive. The suka doesn't wiggle around at all when I move the sword at pace, and the suba is also very tight. Everything fits like it's supposed to fit, and feels very comfortable in the hand. Nothing gives me the sensation that it would be dangerous to use or move around, other than that it's a giant razor blade. The sai is also not bad. It's got a pretty thick profile, which is what you expect from production level swords, and is kind of subjective on if you like it or not. The gloss doesn't look as thick or good as what you might expect to see from some pieces from Hanwei, but it still seems thick enough and nice enough and glossy and pretty. It's not bad at all. I'm just mentioning that it's not as thick. The saya does match, however, the Kashira. It matches up and lines up pretty well, in the sense that aesthetically it's not jarring that one is much larger than the other. Again, something that I see very commonly on production swords, and the attention to detail here is again appreciated. The Kojiri has a nice rounded shape to it, a little bit different than what you expect. Oftentimes I see them as very flat, but this one has a little bit more refined shape, if that's important to you. The Koiguchi also is well formed. It holds the habaki really well. As this is a second-hand sword that's been used, and it's old enough to not be made anymore, the fact that it still holds everything tight is a very good sign of good construction. I'd also note that as I'm looking in the hole here, or in the Koiguchi mouth, I don't see any of the common black resin type substance that I see in a lot of production swords. Now the habaki itself is not perfect, but it's a step above what you commonly see on a lot of production swords in the sense that it has some decorative adornments with 2 feathers. It's a little bit different in terms of coloring. Now this habaki has a little bit of wiggle. It's not necessarily bad. It could probably be tightened up just a little bit, but it's a used sword. It's been used for cutting, and I don't think that that's necessarily strange. That said, if it were a brand new sword, I would certainly expect this part to be tight, but I'll attribute this to the sword having been used and being somewhat old. A rattle in this area might develop over time. It's not uncommon and not something that I'm going to dock the sword for. Now on to the pokey stabby part. The blade itself has a degree of class. Now I know some folks don't necessarily like the look of Chinese folded production sword type steel. In this one, I think it has a lot of character. It's not overly bold, it's still somewhat subtle, and it still has something pleasant to look at if you get up close to it. You can make out the folding pattern or the hada. Also the hamon is very pleasant. The kisaki is there and present. It's even. It's not perfect, but it's there and it's even. The blade is very sharp, the polish is pretty good. The sugata of the blade, or the shape of the blade overall, has a reasonably nice cutting profile. The blade itself is a little bit short for me personally, but them's the breaks. One other piece that I'll note about this blade is that the planes on the blade are relatively even and the lines are pretty clean. Now this isn't something that you have to have for cutting or something that works well as a sword, but it is a level of attention to detail, again in this sword, that I don't see very commonly on production swords. I like that when I look down the lines of the blade and look at the flats on the Shinogi and the Shinogi G, that basically it's all crisp, even, and flat and smooth like glass. A lot of times, even on blades from, say, Hanwei, the Hanwei Bushido, which I think is a reasonable blade to compare this one to, you see all sorts of little ripple lines or little marks from hammering or something to do with the construction of the sword that really shouldn't be there if you're talking about a really refined polish. They're not going to be there on higher end, more refined swords. The fact that they're not here and that these planes are smooth is something that I personally look for and I'm glad to see. Handling wise, the blade feels pretty good in the hand, a little bit stout. I would describe it as lighter on the heavy side. If you take heavier blades, this is on the lighter side of those stout feeling blades. It's reasonably easy to move and change directions with. I didn't have any problem in balance or handling. All in all, the attention to detail in the fittings and how it's constructed and all of those little bits come together to give you a very comfortable, easy experience when using a sword. Nothing is loose. Nothing catches your fingers. Overall, it's a very pleasant experience, and the blade is intended to be a little bit on the heavier, stouter side. It's a thicker blade with no bohea, so in terms of how it handles, I believe that it's expected to feel the way that it does. Nothing about the blade gave me any pause. I would feel totally comfortable cutting harder targets with it. I would feel comfortable doing aya with it. I think that this particular one balances in those two areas pretty well, which is one reason I compared it to the Hanwei Bushido earlier. Again, it's thicker and maybe a little too heavy to do aya with repetitively, or especially if you're looking for something lighter. This isn't necessarily going to do the best job at aya, but it's certainly comfortable enough to use for aya. At the same time, it's not got the profile to do a lot of competition cutting, but cutting-wise, it worked very well and was a very comfortable blade to use, and I wouldn't hesitate using it on much harder targets than I did. So in terms of something that works for either of those two things, I think that this one would. And in fact, when I compare it to a Hanwei Bushido, while I might like the overall fittings in terms of the pieces themselves better on the Bushido, I think I like just about everything else better on this Skyjiro Warlord Katana. So that brings me to the cutting side of things. How did it cut? Well, it cut like a damn demon. Now, I tested this alongside a Cold Steel Emperor Katana, and again, something reasonable that you could compare it to, though the swords have very different audiences and different features. The first cutting that I did with the Cold Steel Emperor really didn't go all that well, so I swung at the mat pretty hard with a Skyjiro Warlord Katana, and if I didn't have my lead leg forward, if I had my right leg forward, I might have cut into it. Now, it surprised me how easily it was to cut, and I drove the tip of the Skyjiro Warlord into the ground, but it didn't suffer any effects. The tip was just fine. I had no issue cutting through with softer strikes through the tatami mat later. I tested it on some water bottles. I whacked the stand a few times with it. The edges held up really well. The blade hasn't really scratched. It didn't bend or deform. And I'm really surprised because I whacked the tip into the ground again with, well, you know, there's rocks and tree trunks and stuff down there, and it didn't deform at all. So I'm pretty impressed with the overall performance of the sword. I thought it was really easy to cut with, a very fun blade to use, and I'm impressed that it didn't get all messed up based on my shitty technique. For those that are interested, these are some of the specifications of the blade, as well as a contrast between what was advertised on the Skyjiro website. Now, note that the handle, or the tsuka, or the suka, whatever you prefer to call it, is about 3/4 of an inch difference between the website and the blade that I have. The blade itself is about 1/2 an inch difference, and that's measured without the habaki. The sori had a slight difference, but again, these are all supposedly handmade, so you'd expect some slight differences. I'll also note that the website had some pretty strange measurements for the sakihaba, motokasane, and motohaba, and some of the, basically it said that the blade should be like 1/2 an inch thick, or 1.5 inches thick, or something like that, and that the blade was 12 inches wide. I think the measurements on the website in millimeters are just a little bit off. So keep that in mind, that I'm negating some of these things or taking some guesses as to what they meant based on the measurements being so goofy. I'm guessing they missed a decimal point or maybe put some in the wrong space, but one of them kind of matches up with 1.25 inches wide. The motokasane is about what I actually measured, so I'm going to assume that they were pretty close. The weight was also only about 1 ounce off. Also note that throughout this review, I've kind of mentioned that this is an $800-ish sword. The original MSRP was $850. It's on their website for sale at $580, and you can find it some other places like Sword and Armory for $550. I, of course, got the blade secondhand, so the MSRP doesn't really apply to what I paid. Now's the part of the review where I'm going to try and answer the question, is it worth it? And that's really difficult to do because it's very subjective. On one hand, the price point is relatively high at $700 or $800. So is it worth it? That's a lot of money. Well, if you're an Aido practitioner, well, yeah, it's good. Skyjiro would probably have a better sword suited to your needs that's lighter. If you're a cutting practitioner where you're dedicated to doing some sort of cutting martial art, then there's probably, again, better products suited. But if you're looking for something that does both in one package and you can really only have one sword, then this is not a bad thing to consider. I had similar feelings to the Hanwei Bushido, and perhaps it's best for me to compare the two of them in the is it worth it. I thought quite a bit of the Hanwei Bushido, and I like the fact that this sword can be used comfortably for either one of those activities. It's something that I think is a great value. When I compare those two, thinking that the Hanwei Bushido is reasonably well worth it, I like this one more than I like the Hanwei Bushido. If I take away just the aesthetics of the liking, the fitting, and all of, or rather liking the overall theme of the sword, I have to say I like the Warlord theme a little bit more, the waves and the black more than the brown and cherry blossoms and samurai theme of the Hanwei Bushido. But I think they just nailed more things on this Skyjiro Warlord sword. I mean, the real claim to fame, or the thing that I think speaks most highly of it, is the attention to details that are often missed. It's got tight ito. The ito lines up with the Fuji Kashira where there's not some giant transition. Everything fits tightly, straight away. There's no goofy resin in the Koiguchi area. The saya and the Fuchi line up in terms of overall aesthetic size. Nothing aesthetically on this sword just draws my eye to it. Again, something that's I strive for when I do custom projects, and something that I think was hit pretty well on the head with this sword. On top of that, the planes of the blade are flat. All of those are just little details that I often see in one way, shape, or form get missed on other production swords that didn't get missed here, and the combination of those things really speaks highly. Also, I whacked the sword into the stand and it didn't get messed up. Also something I appreciate. So I think, yeah, I would rather have this one than a Bushido. I thought the Bushido was worth it, so by proxy I would say that this one is likely worth it, in my mind. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other products with similar specifications that are less expensive, and that's not to say that there aren't other products out there that might be better suited to your needs. And I hope that this review has given you enough information to make an informed buying decision, but if you're asking me, is it worth it? Yeah, I think they earned the $700 to $800 price tag on this one. Cheers, and thanks for watching. Acting! Ah! So it is for Canada, and so it is for the world. So it is for Canada, and so it is for the world.